Hello, everyone, and welcome to the weekly broadcast of Finding Your Unhappy, Unconventional Pathways to Mental Health and Happiness. And I'm really excited to be having a conversation this evening with Molly McClish. Molly McClish used to live in Moab, where I also have lived, and we didn't actually meet there. We connected afterwards based on some of the work that we're both doing. Molly has done many things in her life. She was a high school teacher. She had a dairy. She's been an herbalist. But it was a defining moment in her life that changed everything for her and put her on the path and purpose that she's on now. And that defining moment was losing her daughter to suicide in response to bullying. And it turned her life upside down. It changed everything and put her on this path toward really taking a deep look at mental health and how we view it, how we address it, some of the important things that need to change about how we work with and handle mental health. And so I'm really pleased to be here with Molly tonight to have a conversation about that journey and about how we change some of our perspectives, our culture. How do we start healing and shifting into a place of more health and wholeness around mental health and happiness? So welcome, Molly. I'm super glad that you're here.
Thank you very much.
Is there anything you want to add in way of introduction?
I would only add that the whole path of mental health for me began when I was extremely young. I think I was 5 when I first saw a therapist. And so I've struggled with my own mental health issues throughout my life. But this has radically changed it. And it's really radically changed the way I see it, in terms of the way that we approach it societally, the way we view it, why we're failing in the things we are doing.
Can you talk a little bit then about sort of what your viewpoint was before this pivotal event in your life, and then some of the shift and changes that occurred through that process for you?
Well, some things have stayed the same, and so many
Mm-hmm.
things have um, just destroyed or altered, because of such an intense experience. Um, I think I've always been a mystic. So for me, when I was a child, I would go wander on the hills behind our house. I would spend time in nature, and that was my solace. That was my sanity, because I think I
Mm-hmm.
recognized at a very young age how out of balance, or the things I just saw things that were off in our world and the way we treated one another, in our priorities and our values. Um, but I think I so much of my search and my journey, like through my 20s and even in my 30s, was really surrounding, like, looking outside of myself for answers, even though I knew wisdom within, but I was looking outside of myself for some solution, some answer. And this experience, I guess, has really helped me understand how much that was this I was a product of the way that we approach mental health, as though it's you need to look outside to fix yourself. It's the problem of the person that has an issue
Mm-hmm.
going. And
Right.
become very clear to me through watching my daughter's experience,
Mm-hmm.
um, and then through talking, just countless hours talking with other people who've had similar experiences, and mental health workers, to understand how much our society really puts the onus and the blame on the person, as though something's wrong with them,
Mm-hmm.
when there are definitely people who are born with genetic, um, predispositions for depression or severe, issues that may just be truly genetic. But for the most part, what I've really come to is how much of our experience and these things we struggle with truly comes from some traumatic experience in our life, be it from childhood or from trying to survive in a world that is so off the rails, out of balance. And really,
Mm-hmm.
our values, our cultural values, especially in America, our cultural values of this, seemingly insatiable quest to be enough, to
Oh, excuse me.
That's okay. That it comes from um, these values that we hold as a society. And
Mhm, mhm.
it's kind of a, just seeing how much there's the cop out of just saying, oh, it's easy to say, oh, it's their problem.
The individual problem. Yeah, that I resonate with that so much because I also have had that experience, and I talk about that a little bit in my book of how we pathologize the individual. We are so quick to label and to look at the problem as an individual problem and as an illness with a particular person, rather than really look at the context and conditions in which we live, and that sometimes people are having what I would call emotionally appropriate responses to the environment. One of the things that I mentioned in my book is a statistic that said, that I read at some point when I was doing research for some project, and said the fastest growing population on antidepressants is kindergartners. And so to me, that speaks so much to what you're saying, which is my understanding of young children is that they are very much shaped by their environment. And if you took those kids and put them in a place that met their developmental needs, and they got what they needed, that sort of need to prescribe medication or that illness would be non-existent. And so that's, to me, that's just a really obvious example of what you're saying. Is you took that person out of that environment that is contradictory to what they truly need and put them in a different environment, that what we call like mental illness would evaporate because it's a response to an unhealthy environment.
Exactly. And that's one of that piece of that. And you used a quote that I know, I mean, many people have heard this saying, that to be sane in an insane world is to be insane. And that resonates so much with me, because I feel like the only people who are really doing fine, I mean, we have epidemic proportions of depression, bipolar, anxiety, ideology, you know, all of these things
Yeah.
are so epidemic culture, and that is directly, I think, related to that piece of what you're talking about. Is this, the world is out of balance, and if the world is out of balance, this, the number I was, so as a teacher, the number of students I saw that needed a different environment and different situation to have given them the support that they need was huge. And that is no way to really address these issues until we really look at the root cause, which is really this, we're at a crossroads at this time. I mean, clearly when we look at our political scene, we're clearly at a crossroads, but this is the mass amount of people who are suffering, struggling, or identifying with one of these, you know, any of these ailments, as they would call them. Natural response to when things don't work. I mean, if you look at animals, they will respond to their environment when it is out of balance. And ours is so severely out of balance. And I feel that that's why adolescent suicide in general is on the rise. It's national crises, and it's really a global crisis. But adolescent suicide is frighteningly exponential rate.
Right, because we don't have a culture and a society that really responds to human need, to human connection, to basically basic well-being. And definitely kids are being left behind in a lot of ways, I think. And I think I'm curious also how you see this, but that technology plays a part in sort of the disconnection of our society and the lack of real human contact and nurturing with each other. People are feeling more and more isolated, even as they're more and more, quote, connected. And it can be really super challenging.
Well, and overall, our societal values, when you talk about human well-being, that's something that I really am working hard on, is to try and help people understand that that we're in this crossroads, is really to decide, what do we value? Do we value world where humans really have all of the things to support them in their highest self, in their greatest well-being? Or do we value consumption and greed and money? And our society is very clear. Like, Lily was 13 when she died from suicide. That age, we're all, I mean, I've never met a person who says, I want to go back to middle school because it was so great. It's a hard time in general because of what's happening.
Yeah.
But my daughter was a lovely, bright, shining, happy, empathic, kind, joyful, such a bright human being that brought so much light into the world. And I saw that dwindle and get crushed as she started to see, you know, in those, that differentiation that happens in adolescence, where you step away from all these things you've been told and you see the world in a different context and you try to see yourself in that world. And when the world tells you you're not valuable if you don't fit into these categories, you're not valuable if you have any issues, you're not valuable basically unless you are consuming, and you look and appear in a certain way. And saw her struggle with that. And she was always very empathic. You know, you speak about that in your book. And I think that, and another, you know, it was interesting as I was reading your book, like so many similarities of things that we had kind of come to see through our journeys. But the analogy of the canary in the coal mine, the book that I'm working on, is kind of really rooted in that idea that anyone sensitive who is not okay with this insane world is really, those are our canaries. And sadly, just because you might be an LGBTQIA youth or you might be depressed, that doesn't mean you're going to die from suicide. But the chances are so much higher because of the fact that our world does, the way that we approach mental health and the way that we value one another as human beings.
Well, that brings up an interesting point. I'm thinking about like the healing journey through all that. And one of the things, definitely, I resonate so much with that. Like, there are certain people that are well adaptive or have a higher tolerance, I would say, for dysfunction and cultures and environments that don't meet their needs, right? So they're able to survive in these situations or like toughen it up and function in that way. And then there's those of us that have a really hard time with that and feel like, I don't get it. Like, how do I fit in this world? Because it doesn't make sense. And so one of the things that has helped me is to recognize, okay, I am seeing things and I am being affected by things that have not yet affected other people. Everybody at some level will be impacted and affected by it. And so when you can start to externalize all of that stuff that has been internalized, right? So you can start to take back that sense of like, no, the world is really kind of crazy. And my maladaptive experience is actually me not wanting to buy into that craziness. And so,
or me not being able to,
right,
not
be able to, right? But it's like, can you take out the shame that you have put upon yourself because you can't function as a quote normal person in a dysfunctional society and culture? And the more that I was able to do that, and more I'm able to give myself permission to understand that, like, I am never going to function normally, and that's okay because it doesn't fit my constitution. It doesn't fit who I am. And actually, it's outside of really being nurturing or caring to me as a person or to a lot of us as a person. Then I can start to open myself up to, so what are my options and what are the pathways and how can I, cope or survive or give myself the best path forward given the not healthy environment I live in. And then also, when you're a teenager, it's so much harder to change your circumstances and conditions. If you live in a family that doesn't support you, you're in big trouble, right? You depend on them for your survival. If you go to school, you're just kind of stuck there unless your parents are really helpful with that. But as you get to be an adult, there are choices that you can start to make to say, okay, this is not healthy for me. And I know, like, I don't know if you want to talk about this a little bit, but you left where you lived with your dog because it wasn't supporting you anymore. And I think that's also a big piece that sometimes both in like mainstream the way that the mainstream deals with mental health as well as how like sort of this new age spiritual self-help world deals with mental health is to say it's you can overcome anything, you have the power within you can transform anything, which on some level is true, but it also really discounts, I think, in a lot of ways the powerful effect that environment and people and social dynamics have on our mental health. And that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for your mental health is to change an external factor, a circumstance, move to a different place, change a school, whatever it is, things like that.
If I could go back and change one thing that I think my daughter would be alive if I had, it would have been to go back and pull her out of that school.
Mm-hmm.
She had expressed there was a culture of bullying, there was a tolerance for bullying, there was discrimination was allowed by teachers and students, and that is the thing that if I could change it, and I was going to bring that piece up because that was something that stood out from your book that is one of the most important elements I feel like of what I have come to find in this is that you do have to change your environment because you can try all you want. And I agree. There are times that I read new agey stuff and sometimes it's like, yes, there's beautiful tools in there. And especially with something as extreme as finding your daughter dead at her own hands, there's a certain dismissal of the degree and severity of pain that people truly endure and experience in this life, that it's not so simple to, have a positive outlook on it. And I tend to be, even after Lily, I mean, I struggle in my own way and I work with it every day, but I still am an optimist. I do believe we have this capacity in our nature to be better than we are. But that piece of changing the environment is so huge. I've experienced that multiple times in my life when I've been in toxic environments, toxic situations, toxic relationships, toxic friendships, toxic work environments. And changing that is the way that you reclaim your power to say, I may not have a lot of power to change the world outside. I can try and do things to help. But the only thing I can do is work with myself and with what I have and my own experience, so that piece of changing the environment, that was extremely hard for me. I mean, my home, when I fledged my home and moved out so that I could sell my home was so important to me because it held, for me, I felt that my most important job, and I knew this from a young age, would be being a mother and the people I would leave behind in this world. And so that was something that was so deeply important to me. And that home was where I did all of that work. And that place, that town, was where I did the vast majority of those years of that work, which was my precious role as a mother. And so, but I had to remove myself from the environment because just simply looking at the landscape, looking at the skyline, it's beautiful, it's stunning, it's gorgeous, and yet it caused so much pain. It made me want to die so badly because all it did was put me back in the place of the loss and this intense, searing pain of being here without her here. And so I changed that to be able to remove the triggers that made it so difficult for me every day, that were causing me to clench my teeth and set my jaw to the point that I felt my teeth would shatter, or that I was going to have a heart attack, or just like I described it once to my therapist as like a splitting sensation. Is so much pressure that I felt like I was literally splitting in two. And so I still have experienced that since leaving, but it's very different. The intensity of it is different. And so self-care, when we love ourselves and we say, I deserve to be loved. I deserve to love myself. I deserve to care for myself. I feel very much of this process has been almost a process of birthing myself. I feel like I've given birth to myself again because I had to allow this other self to die in a way.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that was something that through this intensity of this process, I had to be in the safest place. You know, you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, those basic things, safety. So many of the things that trigger us, that make us have these, what people would call, you know, a problem or a disease of these responses are a result of these triggers. And when you don't feel safe, you can't do anything because you are functioning solely on such a fight and flight mechanism.
Right, the flight and fight trauma.
Choosing what your environment, the people you have in your immediate space. I only choose to have people around me and to talk to people who are positive and uplifting, who are going to help me move forward in a positive way or an encouraging way, not in a way that says, well, you know, I definitely have had to cut people out of my life that say things like, well, how come you're not over it already? And I
Yeah.
just, okay,
That's,
you know, like,
yeah,
that's
that's
clearly.
another huge piece. And actually, before I go on, I just want to invite for anybody who's watching, if you have a comment, a question, a thought, if you want to join the conversation, definitely put it in the chat box and we'll include that in here. Have you had an experience where changing your environment made a huge difference for you? What have you come to discover about your own mental health journey that made a difference for you? And do you notice that environments affect your mental health, or that the people around you have an impact? Because that's certainly, we started with sort of environment, but people is another piece, and also something that I write about in my book is another huge factor. And I find that one of the fastest ways to make myself feel better is to do what I call a friend inventory or a people inventory, and look at who are the people in my life and how am I relating to them and how do I feel about those relationships, and then adjust any relationship that doesn't feel good to me, that is bringing me down, is affecting my self-esteem or how I feel about myself. Up. And looks like we lost Molly there, but that can make such a huge difference to just how I feel in my life. And that's all right. Here she comes. You'll be back in one. Okay, there you go. You're back. And so, yeah, just there's actually an exercise in my book, Finding Your Own Happy, if you're not aware. So Finding Your Own Happy, and you can get a free copy at findingyourownhappybook.com. And in it, there is an exercise that talks about looking at the context and conditions in which you live, starting to understand them, and then what you can do to start to change them, to support your mental health, to support your happiness. And that includes, it includes your work environment, your home environment, all those kind of things, as well as the people that you have in your life, and what kinds of relationships that you have with them. And I know sometimes, I don't know what your experience is with your own family of origin, but I know for some people we've internalized so much from that. And there's also this, if we're talking about cultural input and cultural idea, a lot of should about what kind of relationship you should or shouldn't have with your family of origin. And yet it's a source of stress and unhappiness for so many people that I know. And what if you could look at that in a different way and be willing to really see? So a little exercise that I do, and I don't think this is in the book actually, but is to remove the label. So let's take my mom, for example. If my mom were not my mom, if she were just somebody that I knew, how would I feel about how our interactions? How would I feel about how she engaged with me? Would it work for me or would it not work for me? And actually did this with my parents one time because I had all of this sort of guilt about our relationship. And I recognized, like, oh, I when I am the one that initiates relationship all of the time with someone else, I don't really enjoy that. And those people don't end up staying in my life. And then I realized, oh, with my parents, I only hear from them when I reach out to them. And it didn't stop reaching out to them and I didn't stop having a relationship with them, but it helped me see it in a sort of more neutral context to say, oh, okay, that's what's going on. And that I don't really, it's not my preference. Because there can be so much clouding and all of this should and all of this.
And
I do have
especially
that feeling with quote.
we were
Yeah, go ahead.
and so we have all of the conditioning of our childhood that normalizes what that relationship is. And then
Yes.
we live in a society that says, that doesn't know how to deal with conflict, that doesn't know how to really say, it's okay for you and I to disagree on something. It's okay for us to have a conversation and we can respect one another and we can see things differently. We don't live in a world that functions that way. And so, I mean, we want to say we do, but it seems like it's a lot of
Well, there's
games.
also the thing of like, I'm going to say something that's maybe really controversial for some people and taboo, but like, it's really not okay to say you don't like somebody in your family. And yet there are very legitimate reasons to dislike someone. And we dislike people all the time. We have personality clashes. They rub us the wrong way. We just don't get along with them. We don't identify them. And yet when it comes to family, like the truth is you probably don't like somebody in your family. And yet to say that is such a taboo. And yet I think it can be really liberating to be like, yeah, I don't. And how do I choose to, like, there are reasons to choose to have people in your life. There are reasons to choose not to have people in your life. And what do you choose? And can you choose a place that's going to create as little discord as possible while honoring and protecting and caring for you as much as possible? So, like, where are you just destroying yourself for relationships, whether it's your family or whether it's someone else? And can you get to the place where you're taking care of yourself adequately to maintain those relationships? And if you can't, I mean, there are people in my family that I don't talk to right now because I couldn't adequately take care of myself and move forward with my life and continue to maintain those relationships. And made
sadly,
me feel crazy sometimes.
Sometimes we have to say, this person, you know, I'm one of the, for me, I accept differences or things, you know,
Mm-hmm.
interesting as you age, how you see things, the dynamics in your family, and you can maybe sometimes come to these realizations about how love is sometimes expressed in ways that we don't understand. But
Yeah.
it's critical for people to understand that you can set a boundary with someone in your life that's in your family without being unkind. It doesn't make you a jerk or a mean person. You don't have to say, oh, I hate that person. It's just in yourself, you know that they make you feel unsafe. You don't like the way they make you feel, that there's a toxicity there. It is absolutely okay to say, I'm going to just avoid that. And you can do it with kindness. And sometimes that might mean not showing up for things that maybe you would want to, you know, or sometimes you decide, I'm going to stuff that aside and I'm going to kind of avoid that person a little bit so I can go participate in this family endeavor or celebration or something. But yeah, family is a very complicated piece that,
Yeah.
you know,
And there's an interesting tension in what you're saying. I also hear this interesting tension that goes beyond family to other relationships, where there's this real tension that I see with a lot of my clients and then have felt often in myself about tension between like what works for me and how do I care about myself, and then how do I be in relationship with other people that is in a way that works. And a little bit, and I think this might be more of a feminine thing than a masculine thing, but this feeling of guilt if I don't want to talk to somebody, if I don't like them, if I don't enjoy their company, if I'd rather not be around them, there's this sense of like, severe guilt and I'm being a bad person or so forth. And I know that my mental health has depended on being able to have some of those boundaries and to say, you know what, this relationship is not working for me. And sometimes it's a matter of adjusting how I relate. And sometimes
Mhm.
it really is a matter of removing myself from those relationships. And I just want to give anybody who's watching permission to really recognize and include yourself in the equation of your life, whether it's your relationships, whether it's your job, whether it's your family. Like, how do you find a way to engage with all of that that has the same respect and care for you that you give to other people? And if you are treating yourself less well than the people around you, that's something to look at and to adjust, because you deserve to treat yourself just as well as you, and with just as much consideration as you give anyone else. And sometimes that means um, doing things that maybe on the face of it seem unpopular or don't make other people happy. Like, what if you gave up the job of making other people happy at your own expense? I mean, yes, we can all contribute to each other's happiness, but there comes a time when other people's happiness or satisfaction or approval of you comes at the expense of your own self. And I mean, I see that as it's been a difficult lesson and difficult learning, and I've had to be willing to be by myself and alone, and yet I'd rather have myself and be alone than give up myself and have those relationships.
I'd like to just chime in that for me, surviving this experience has been very much about being in tune with that every day, is saying, I don't care
Mm-hmm.
how anyone else would try to endure or survive this experience. This is my journey. And for all of us, I'd like to add to that, giving permission. We are all on our own personal journey in this life. Yes, we are connected. Sometimes that's a struggle for me to accept, because there are definitely people I look at and I'm like, I'm not that. But we are connected, and we have this duty and responsibility to one another as human beings to support one another. But ultimately, the person that keeps you safe is you. And that doesn't mean you have to throw up walls and burn bridges left and right, but it does mean being very, like, your number one priority is to say, I only function well. I only can be in this world and give to others when I'm taking care of myself, when I am safe, when I am able to protect myself and see myself as precious. And we all should see ourselves as precious. And yet we don't. The norm in our culture is to only see all of our various flaws, how we don't meet up, how, all things. So rethinking, and so for me, that's what the last 3 years has really been. And I think I've spent, even before Lily died, so much of my 20s was about, I stopped watching TV, and I didn't allow myself to be exposed to any of those things that would tell me I wasn't okay the way I was. And
Mm-hmm.
that was very liberating. And yet still I had these things that I would struggle with, especially when it would come to relationships. And so, but that, coming to that as the number one priority, is like the sacredness that is within all of us, that we should be treating ourselves with and approaching one another with. And if someone is off in a very dark place or is in a toxic place, that doesn't mean that they are evil. It truly means they are suffering. I mean, I look
Mm-hmm.
at, Gabor Mate is a physician who I
Yes,
really
I
love.
love I love his work so much. Yes.
I love his description of us as a biopsychosocial being. So we are not just this body of of skin and bones. We are the psychosocial bio. We are all of those things together, and we deeply are impacted by one another. And so when he talks about addiction, I look at addiction, um, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, ADHD, all of these things in our society, even our physical, like you think about like the increase in cancers and heart attacks and strokes. We are a stressed out, fringed out culture that is not caring for itself. And so those things come out of trauma. And so it is a turn. It's this desire to escape those things in these other ways. And I really love his approach and a lot of the things that he says. It's been a comfort to, and very difficult for me because, he talks about people who have committed suicide and they've been studied their brains, and they have looked at, commonalities in experience, and he works. What I think I appreciate most about him is that he doesn't just I think our society tends to ignore the traumas and think they should be some isolated event that you can like package up, treat, like put a Band-Aid on, put some, Neosporin on, and it's going to be fine. Versus seeing that it is this constant compounded trauma from our society that really creates so many debilitating problems. And
Right.
he traces it back to the womb. And so, going all the way into utero, and stresses that the mother experiences when she's pregnant, how much that they find that that's a commonality between all people who commit suicide, is that almost all of them go back to there was some stress in utero. If it wasn't some like truly genetic, like there was no event in a life that happened. But outside of those people who truly have not had some kind of traumatic event, but even some of those being teased out into what was the experience of your mother's while she was pregnant with you, and how much
That's so
that.
interesting. I never had heard that before, but I mean, I have a story of that I looked at in some of my healing work was what was going on with my mom when she was pregnant with me, which was my dad didn't leave her, like they were still together, but he left and went to a different country. And so she was pregnant by herself, and he was off doing some other thing in some other country. And so, and in some of the inquiry work that I do in working with the subconscious, we went down to that level and looked at that level, and some of the beliefs and the feelings that I had about being wanted or belonging went all the way back to that. And so that, I mean, and yeah, I've been a person that I'm still here today, but I've definitely many times in my life wanted to leave and thought about leaving. And yes, I think the trauma piece also, you talk about trauma, and what I think about as sort of trauma is living day in and day out in an environment that is not meeting our evolutionary expectations. It's not taking care of human needs. It's not tending to our well-being. That in itself is traumatizing. And I mean, and he also talks about how just we live in a traumatized society and how we function out of trauma. And when I was younger, when I was in college, I did a lot of research and a lot of study about kids and childhood and the culture of childhood. And one of the people that what was his name? Anyway, one of the people that I quote in some of the studies was talking about oppression, and he had been connected to all levels of society and was talking about oppression, and that and this I think translates to trauma also, that the root of all oppression is childhood oppression. Because if you weren't oppressed in your childhood, if you weren't traumatized essentially in your childhood, you would be incapable of tolerating and perpetrating that kind of oppression or that kind of trauma on other people. And so to me, so much of the work goes back to, and that's how I sort of started my journey, is how do we heal our culture around kids and childhood so that we're raising whole people that aren't traumatized and then aren't likely to inflict their pain on others. But then you also go back to my parents were traumatized for sure. They grew up in traumatized childhood with traumatized childhoods and traumatized families. And they wanted to change that. They wanted to break that link, but they didn't, in some ways they weren't capable of it, right? And so then my experience of childhood trauma is really being passed down from their experience of childhood trauma. And then here I am doing this work to try to shift and change my own internal landscape so that I'm not continuing to perpetuate that cycle.
Yeah, he speaks a lot about, epigenetic trauma that we all carry on. And I mean, I'm fascinated by epigenetic, the idea of epigenetics, this idea that we pass on through our blood and our DNA much more than the color of our eyes and the pigment of our
Mhm.
skin. That there are these traumatic memories that are passed on, and they're passed on through our blood and our essence, as well as, I think, like you're saying, these predispositions and people who are our parents, and we all, hopefully try to do better than our parents did, but they're working
Mhm.
with their limited box of how much they were able to work through because of their own passed down trauma, and
Absolutely.
and the age and time in which they live. And we are at this place where we're at a major crossroads where we're like making this choice as a species about which direction we want to go. And that path of listening, of taking the time to go into stillness, to taking,
Mhm.
choosing to, something you talk about in your book, and that's something that I've also come to see, is that there's no way to get through trauma versus going completely through it. I mean, I knew that I had like four choices after Lily died. I was like, well, I could go, I could become a drug or alcohol addict. I could kill myself, which really wasn't an option because I had promised everyone that I loved that I would be here, even though I wanted to. And I still struggle with that on a very frequent, where the pain is so unbearable and so overwhelming that I wish so badly that I could just, please let me get cancer. Please just let me just have a heart attack.
Right.
You know,
And some of
peace.
that, on the point of suicide, so much of, I was reading something recently, but so much of the suicidality is we want the pain and suffering to end
Yes.
more than whether or not, I think it's whether or not it's a life or death choice. It's the pain and suffering that is
Yes.
unbearable.
And
That
I think that's really important because there is so much stigma around suicide. I mean, we talk about
Mhm.
anxiety, depression, and how people target and say it's the person's fault. Suicide is a whole other level. It's like, oh yeah, well, I mean, if you even look at like priorities and funding, there's funding to help people when their family member is murdered. There's not funding to help when their family member commits suicide or dies by
Mhm.
suicide, I should say, because commits is part of that. Using the words commits is part of that whole putting it on them like they've committed a crime, even though.
Right. That's such an interesting point. I was thinking, just we don't have a like commit suicide, or there's not like an active verb of sort of they suicide.
Yeah,
Um,
I have to play with that. It's always like she died from suicide, because suicide,
right.
like a result of a disease like cancer. Because
Mhm.
And yet the thing I think I feel, yes, I think they've found obviously cancer can be genetic, it can be environmental, it can be exposure, it can be all these different things. Depression and suicide are very much the same way. Some of it can be genetic, but it also is very much environmental and what you're exposed to in these traumas. And so shifting the way that we think about how we approach that is critical in terms of seeing it truly as a disease, but also taking responsibility, because too many, I feel like so much of our culture is all about shirking responsibility. And we all
Mhm.
have to take responsibility for the power and impact we have on one another. So, like you said, sometimes someone's toxic and you have to cut them out of your space or have a boundary where you really buffer and limit your exposure. But when you are suffering so greatly, and like you said, it is not a life and death situation. It is purely, and what I have experienced is such an intense, when I talk about the burning, it is literally like, picture feeling like you're burning alive. You are searing in so much pain, and all you want to do is run. You want to run and get away,
Mhm.
and you can't. And the only way that I have learned to try and endure that and to try and move through that is just sit and hold it, to sit with it. And that is not what we are trained and conditioned in our society to do.
Know it.
Not have
Not
a
at all.
We have a society that says, take these pills, turn it away. Because when I was saying like I had four choices, I was like, well, if I just go pretend like this isn't happening to me, then I am not being utterly annihilated. That every aspect of my identity is not being completely destroyed right now.
Mhm.
I could, yeah, those it was like stuff it away, go back to work, but that would be living a life of a zombie. And I don't want that life. And I do feel like it's okay for me to choose if I'm going to be here, if I am going to be here and really choose to be, I do not want my life to be that. I
Mhm.
cannot live. I have to live in a way that feels true to who I am and the truth that I see. And when you have someone so close to you and you have such something so extreme and profound, like ripped away in a moment like that, all of the things that our society thinks are so important are so clearly like the disconnect with value is
Mhm.
that is itself a trigger for me. So when I go into town and I see just so much, just like all of these, I feel bombarded by consumption, by all of these things that we buy and do and that fuel our economy and that make us think that we're going to be okay and they're not. And those things when I'm exposed, when I go into town, those things I have to prepare myself. I know it's going to, it triggers me every time. And it is because
Yeah.
so far away from our essence of who we truly are. And I truly think away from the essence of who we are as a species. I do not feel like what we are or the way our society is right now is us being our true nature. I think that maybe we've been experimenting with some of our worst nature for some time, but I don't believe that that is truly our nature.
Right,
You
the
know,
disconnections. There's a actually going back to Gabor Mate, he has a talk that he does where he talks about four different levels of disconnection.
the four
And
alien.
yeah, the four alienations, which is a Marxist thing, but he talks about that and I can't remember exactly what they are, but it made so much sense. Like we're alienated from each other, we're alienated from ourselves, our own internal drives, our own internal sense of things. He says, and I love this, like babies are not disconnected from themselves. They know how they feel about things. And our culture has taught us so much to blame ourselves and to cut ourselves off from how we feel, right? So this feeling that shows up in your life, wherever it shows up, is like as a baby, you trust that. You just go with that. You let it guide you almost. And then through our conditioning, we're cut off to it to the point where so many of us think that our feelings are wrong, that our feelings are bad, that there's something wrong with us for having feelings or feeling the way that we do, when actually it's an indicator of so many, it's it's our mechanism for navigating life in some way that we've lost touch with. So if somebody says something to you and it doesn't feel good, that's an indicator for you. But
Oh,
then we've
absolutely.
learned how to internalize that and say, wait a minute, oh, there's something wrong with me. I don't feel good. I have issues. No, what if actually you are getting information that is important to understand? But going back to what you're talking about, like because of the alienation from yourself, from your own truth, it's easier to be manipulated by other people. So many people feel disconnected. They don't have that sense of meaning or connection in their lives. And then of course, what do? We fill it up with stuff, with buying stuff, with the things that we think are going to make up for the real meaning in life, the real value in life. And yet it it is empty. And when you get to a point where you lose the things that are most valuable to you, it sounds like for you it's like that stark contrast of really seeing that and understanding that none of that matters, none of that is important compared to losing someone I love and being connected in that way.
And honestly, that was I have had that approach for a long time and I raised my children that way. And there are times, I mean, as I'm sure you can imagine through this process, it's been this never ending cycle of peeling away, just constantly
Mhm.
lots of just peeling down to the rock or but I have never I raised my kids to believe I raised my kids that way. And so to listen to themselves and to trust themselves, and that things were out of balance. And that piece that you're talking about is like, that's the thing, that's something I'm deeply grateful for my mother, because she was the one who really tried to teach me and instill in me, listen to yourself, listen to.
Mm-hmm.
But it took a long time to fight those societal things. I mean, I feel like I was always kind of functioning a little bit on the periphery, like not necessarily doing it in the way I was supposed to, but really learning to listen. And when you're going through acute traumatic pain and you're struggling, it's really hard because that's really noisy. But we are, like you're talking about the four alienations, that's one of the worst ones. I mean, they're all really, the four things are really, we see them all manifest in our culture right now. And they are directly a result of our culture and our structure, economic structure, and what reflects our values and our priorities as a society. But that one, that alienation from self, is probably, I think, the worst. I mean, I love nature, and for me, nature has been so much my healer. I go into nature, that is, I feel safe. I feel the support that I need. I can feel the clarity and openness. That's my healing place. So that was one of the alienations as well, was alienation from nature, which we see in the way that we're treating the earth, and we have all of these, yet people still want to deny it. So alienate,
And
like,
even just from place, like I think of not even just nature as sort of we commonly think about it, but alienation from your neighbors, from your neighborhood, from a sense of place or belonging in the world and where you live. Just before, I just want to actually pivot the conversation a little bit to talk about like some pathways toward, and we've woven them in a little bit, but to really talk about like, what are some of the pathways toward reconnection with self, toward finding your own happy, toward shifting from all that we've talked about that's sort of a challenge toward real mental health and happiness, and what are some of the things that we can start to do individually and collectively to move to a healthier place, to move to a place where we are. I mean, the title of my book is Finding Your Own Happy. It's also a collective job. So
absolutely. It's on an individual level. We have our own individual path in this life. And ultimately, all of our paths are truly to evolve, for us to have experiences that push us, that teach us, that are difficult for us, that help us expand and evolve as a species. And collectively, our society and what our society says its values are really defines so many of these other things on our own individual experience. And so it has to happen on both levels. And so, you know, people who are struggling have one path, but even people who feel fine, they may say, I'm happy, my life's good, I'm fine. They have an equal responsibility to still ensure that the world is, that they're not alienating their little happy bubble, like, oh, I'm fine by myself, that you are still connected to all of these other beings around you. And so on the individual level, there's a bravery, because this is not the path for the weak of heart. This is not the path for the people who would much rather stick their head in the sand and say, no, I cannot do that, because it's scary and it's hard.
And for some of us, you know, for the sensitive people among us who are, or the canaries, it's like there is no other option but to say, how do I survive? I can't ignore what I know. I can't ignore my experience, and I'm required to find a different way if I'm going to choose to stay on planet Earth. Sort of what you're saying is like, I refuse to choose to stay here and have my life be this way. And I've definitely been at choice points where like, okay, you know, I got to choose to commit to having a life here. And how am I going to make that a life worth living? We have just a question actually from one of the audience, which is about how do sensitive, awake people make connections locally? We can find each other on the internet, but it seems we are all so far apart. My answer to that, and then I'll love to hear your answer, I'm moving. Honestly, like I have lived I love Moab where I have lived, and I have not found my tribe and not found my people. And it has affected me. Right now I'm visiting Oregon, and I feel like a different person here because I am around people that speak more of my language, that get me a little bit better, that it's just a whole different energy. So it goes back to the beginning of this conversation, is that context and conditions matter. And I know not everybody has it in their power to just up and relocate, but that's a piece. And, or if you can find one or two people that can't move, one or two people that do get you, do see you, and then build from there, that's also a piece. But Terry, I don't know how helpful that is for you, but that's my honest solution. Is I've stayed so many times in places where I just thought it was me and I had to make it work, and realize how much I limited myself by living in like small rural towns where I couldn't find people that I really connected with, and thinking like, oh, it's just me, it's just my consciousness. And then looking at that now saying, wow, I was really, instead of really recognizing the limitations of the environment I was in and what it had to offer, I blamed it on me. And if I had just changed where I was and the environment I was in, my life might have felt and been very different. So she says, yes, I've considered that. Now I'd love to hear your point of view now that I answered that question.
I would agree. I would say, I have felt like I have been different my entire life. I definitely, as a child, different. And although I was friendly with everybody, I had lots of friends, my very close connections were smaller and much more intimate. So I do feel like there's this thing, what I find happens since Lily died, especially. I think this has happened my whole life, and I'm much more aware of it since she died, because I'm also very careful about who I'm interacting with. Is there's something you see in someone's eyes, and you notice certain things in the way that they interact with others. You see a kindness, you see an openness, and those are the people that make the effort to engage with, right? Those are the people saying, hey, I'm here with an open heart. I'm not coming in with all of these other things that you're told by the rest of the world. So that can be a really good way, is just really watching. And I think that because we're in such a fast, hurried society, and our life and our culture is just so fast and insane. I personally choose to live in a very small town, very remote, and I like that. For me, that's my sanity and my safety, is I need very small doses with people. But I do want my interactions with people to be very fulfilling and to be genuine. So I think you might find something I've been surprised by is finding those connections in places I didn't expect them. So people that I found myself maybe stereotyping, where I would not want to necessarily admit I was stereotyping, but just being willing to engage in some dialogue, to risk a little bit of that, but to know if it doesn't go in a positive direction with that person, that's okay. That you don't internalize that. And it's always that's why when I was saying that, it's like seeing yourself is like you're birthing yourself, you're mothering yourself. Being the nurturer, the protector, means you're going to say, okay, yeah, well, cool. I wish you the best. I'm going my own way. And but when you find it, it's immediate. You tend to have a conversation, and there's just that thing that happens.
That's so, it's funny that you say that, because I had this realization in the last couple of years of efforting toward being connected with someone or having a relationship with someone. And I said, wait a minute, like, what makes me think that like the 10th time I've reached out is going to suddenly make the difference and this relationship is going to change? And then I thought about the people that I really have connected with in my life and that have been good friends in my life. And usually it happens fairly immediately. Within a couple connections, we're moving toward each other and we're getting connected with each other. And I've had this habit of like chasing after people and trying to connect, and then that didn't serve me, and it didn't help my feeling of good about myself. And so I just recognized, oh, okay, when I meet the people that I resonate with, I'm gonna know it and I'm gonna feel it. And that's definitely happened where you just, it's
Just as
like I had this sort of experience of like, wow, I feel like I've been holding my breath, but I didn't realize it until I had that I let it out. And that's like when I met somebody who saw me or got me, or like there was just a resonance. It was like this relaxing experience of,
it's a real
okay, well, it's a relief, and it makes such a big difference. So pay attention to those kinds of things and how you feel, and yeah, learn to use your inner compass of your, I mean, I call it your emotional navigation system. You know, it's so much, I've really shifted how I see feelings. And the more I've learned to listen to them and recognize that they have information for me, actually, the less emotional and sort of unemotional roller coaster I've been, because so much of that roller coaster is the confusion about what's true. The more I trust myself and trust what's true for me, and then I just adjust, the less I'm going like this all of the time. And
I
go ahead.
agree. I feel like that trust of self, and that's also something that comes from, I'm an outgoing introvert. I require
Mhm.
and especially since Lily died, I require an enormous amount of time alone or with my partner in my space. Um, but in general, I've always kind of been that way. So something I strongly recommend is the peace and that ability to listen to yourself that comes from stillness, that comes just
Mhm.
into, if you find wherever it is. For some people it might be a park. For me, it's going, I like to be isolated in nature and not see people. I like to go and be, and I like to be near water and have trees. But whatever your place is, you find some place that you feel at ease and connected,
Mhm.
and you just taking time to sit in that stillness and to tune out this constant busy. There's so much noise that goes on up there that is about how we interact with that world and with society and all of these messages. And like you said, discerning what is yours and what is someone else's, what is yours, what is the world's. All of those things take this very in-depth work of stillness. And some people, after they lose someone and they go through tragedy, they go climb mountains. I sit and meditate. So I'm like, stillness has been the key for me to really tease out that listening, to fine tune the listening. And those souls, I truly believe also that when you are in that place where you are ready and wanting to connect with others, you're continuing to be in stillness, but just you're energetically putting that out there, right? And you're going to be drawing people to you who you need. But have faith that the people you draw to you are the people you need, which is sometimes, I think that sometimes the difficult work that that is taken to be able to be at peace in some way is really hard, because we want it to all be rosy. We want it to all just be like shiny and good. And sometimes life brings us things that are challenging, that are really difficult, that push us into uncomfortable places that we would rather not deal with. But they're for a reason, because there's some aspect of something we're working with within ourselves, and how we relate to others, and how we relate to ourselves, and how we relate to the world. So just have some faith in the people. Just start noticing the people that are kind of drawn into your space and drawn to you, and have faith that there's a reason. But with the premise of keeping yourself safe is the primary importance. You have to not be drawn in by toxic people. I mean, you have to have some filters for things that, okay, if these people are coming into my space and they're toxic, there's something I need to look at more in terms of
Right.
what I'm participating in and how I protect
The
myself.
more the more that you know yourself and you know your own truth and you trust you, and I write about this in the book, is putting trust back in yourself and learning how to trust yourself again. And the more that you do that, the easier it is to navigate, the easier it is to recognize when something needs to change, external or internal, and point yourself in to lining up again with truly finding your own happy and being able to navigate that. And so for anybody who's sort of in this territory, I highly encourage you to check out my book, Finding Your Own Happy, because there are a bunch of tools in there for helping you get out of, like you said, going out in nature is such a great way to, especially for empathic people, to separate out and start to feel you again. And before I really understood my journey, I would just get to the point where I couldn't take it anymore, and I would just run away from life, basically. But and sometimes at the point where I felt like I was suicidal. And yet after 24 hours or 48 hours or however long away from everybody else and away from everybody else's energy, I realized I'm okay. I've just been burdened by so much of everybody else's energy. And so to come back to your own self and your own sense of self can make such a big difference in how you navigate and how you move forward in your own life. And so again, you can get the book at findingyourownhappybook.com, free copies, because I wrote it to help people who are on this journey, and there's some great resources in there for you.
I'd like to chime in just about the book as well, that, like, you know, on my own journey, I've been surprised over and over again how when I have faith in my process and I have faith in myself, and when I'm just open, I am led to exactly the right thing at the right time. And I've received information from so many different places and so many different approaches. And, you know, I've always been some non-denominational when it comes to religion. I feel the same way with this. There's no one answer that works for all people, but there are bits of wisdom and guidance and tools that can be very valuable in terms of at least pushing you in a direction. And then, you know, you find your other tools as needed. And I feel like your book really does speak to some of those very important components, especially the really taking assessment of your situation, the people in your life, what you're doing for work, how that makes you feel, as well as that really going into trusting yourself and learning to listen to yourself and recognize and honor yourself. And those are not things that we are conditioned to do. So one thing I just want to just add is that what we're talking about and what you write about in your book are all things that go against everything we're taught from the time we are young. Our schools, they all need to be basically dismantled and reconstructed. I'm sorry for all my friends who are teachers. Most teachers would probably agree. There is a very dysfunctional approach to education. And that needs to be. But we are so taught to not do those things. And so I highly recommend your book. I feel that it helps. You have some really good checklists of processes. Like, here's some very specific things to ask yourself. So for those of you who are like feeling like you're just kind of wandering in the fog or in the dark, those questions, and like you said, always going back to questions and awareness. Those are two critical components, I feel. And that is questions, always question, and being self-aware, being aware of how you feel and listening to yourself. And those things are just so critical in this journey. And just remember, you're not going to get the feedback from society that says, yeah, that's the way to do it. You're going to get everything that says, what? That's not, dismissive, whatever. You have to choose this path purely because it resonates with your soul. And that journey of your soul in this life and you being aligned and completely committed to that is really your purpose for being here. And I feel like
what finds your own happy.
Yes, exactly. Because
I know that we could keep talking for hours. And so maybe we'll get to have another conversation, because this has been really wonderful. And
I have a page full of notes that I wanted to talk about. So that would be fun.
There's so much to say, and there's so much to explore on this topic, and so much that we don't say so much, especially when it comes to suicide. Actually, I want to do a show just on that and just on talking about suicide, because I feel like for me, I've started to understand what has been behind my suicidality, all of the contributing factors, and then what takes me out of it. Yeah, so let's definitely do another one going forward. And And for anybody watching, I am here every week at 6:30 Pacific time, Tuesday evenings, having conversations about mental health and happiness, unconventional pathways to happiness and wholeness and to your mental health. And I will be here next week. I believe that my guest is someone that you're not going to want to miss. I think it's we're going to be talking about psychological injury and the psychological injury model, which is a lot about kind of what we've been alluding to, but that mental health is almost, or into a very large degree, even things like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are affected by trauma and what has been labeled psychological injury. So that's going to be also a really interesting conversation. So be sure to come back next week and join me for that. And I'll definitely let you know when Molly and I are going to have our next conversation. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Again, my name is Alana Davidson of Divine Essence Coaching and author of Finding Your Own Happy, The Soul Searcher's Guide to Peace and Happiness in Everyday Life. And I will put that link to get the book also in the comments, as well as we were talking about Gabor Mate, so I'll include his link as well as we didn't talk about this at all, but Molly has a foundation that she set up after her daughter died, and I'll put the link there as well so you can check out her work as well. And thank you all, and bye for now.